Blake stood in the chill night air, the flickering street lamp casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The city around him never slept, but he felt utterly alone. The familiar creak of the old apartment door didn't comfort him like it used to. It reminded him of all the nights spent hoping, waiting, and eventually feeling betrayed. 5 years. That was how long it had been since Ivy turned her back on him when he needed her the most. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the cold air biting at his skin. It was almost surreal how much had changed, yet how some wounds never fully healed. Losing his job had been brutal. Marketing was all he'd ever known. The hustle, the late nights, the pitches that barely landed. When the company downsized, Blake was the first to go. It wasn't just the paycheck that vanished. It was his identity, the routine that gave his life meaning. Then, as if fate wanted to push him even further down, his girlfriend left without a word. No explanation, no fight, just silence. Like a ghost slipping out of his life, leaving behind only memories and a hollow ache in his chest. Blake found himself adrift, the weight of failure pressing down. He had nowhere to go, nowhere to turn. But there was Ivy. Ivy, the girl who had been there since their first scraped knees on the playground, the one who had shared every secret, every dream. When she had struggled, Blake had opened his home, his heart, his wallet. When she was hurting, he was there, always. So, with hope that maybe this time would be different, Blake reached out. A place to crash, he said. Just a roof, a bed, and a moment to catch his breath. He'd pay for his share, work odd jobs, anything. But Ivy had a different answer. "Things are tight," she said, her voice cold and distant. "I wish I could help." The words cut deeper than any insult. It wasn't just the refusal, it was the indifference. The way she avoided his eyes, like he was a stranger asking for a favor instead of the brother he thought she was. He swallowed the sting and found another friend, someone who saw his struggle and didn't turn away. Slowly, painstakingly, Blake rebuilt. A new job, a modest apartment, a circle of people who actually cared. Years passed. The wounds faded but never disappeared. He never forgot how it felt to be abandoned in the dark. And now here he was, standing on Ivy's doorstep. The tables had turned. The knock was soft but resolute. The door opened, and there she was, her face drawn, eyes shadowed with desperation and regret. "I need a place," Ivy said, voice barely above a whisper. "Just a few weeks. I'm down on my luck." Blake looked at her, memories flooding back, the promises broken, the nights he stayed up wondering what he'd done wrong. He smiled then, but it wasn't the smile she remembered. It was slow, cold, deliberate. "I wish I could help," he said, every word weighed with quiet finality. "But things are tight. No more explanations, no more empty promises." Blake stepped back into the night, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. Revenge wasn't about shouting or chaos. Sometimes it was the simple act of closing a door that once welcomed you in. And for Blake, this was only the beginning. Blake's apartment was quiet, but his mind was a storm. The soft hum of the city outside did little to calm the turmoil within him. Ivy's desperate eyes, once so full of life and confidence, now shadowed with fear and uncertainty, refused to leave his thoughts. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if he should feel sorry for her. But he quickly pushed the thought away. Sympathy was a luxury he couldn't afford, not after the cold rejection he had lived through. He settled into his worn leather chair, poured a neat whiskey into a glass, and took a slow sip. The warmth spread through his chest, but it did nothing to thaw the icy knot of betrayal twisting inside him. Blake thought back to the years they'd known each other. Ivy had been more than a friend. She'd been his family. Through every heartbreak, every loss, she'd been there, leaning on him as much as he'd leaned on her. But when he had fallen, when the world had knocked him down and he reached out for her hand, she pulled away. "Things are tight," she said. No explanation, no offer to help. Just cold, dismissive words that stung more than any fight. The memory hardened his resolve. He pulled his laptop onto the table, fingers hovering over the keyboard as he weighed his options. What did Ivy want now? Was it pity, forgiveness, or simply a lifeline she could grab onto? Blake wasn't sure if he even cared anymore. But one thing was clear. He wouldn't be her safety net this time. He started digging. Social media profiles, public records, old mutual friends. He traced Ivy's steps over the past few years. What he found wasn't pretty. Ivy had burned bridges everywhere. Friendships turned sour over broken promises and lies. Her carefully crafted image of a strong, independent woman was just a mask, hiding a trail of debts and betrayals. The very people who had once called her friend now whispered about her behind closed doors. She was alone. Blake's heart clenched, not with pity, but with a fierce determination. She deserved this fall. The loneliness she felt was a reflection of the coldness she'd shown him. He messaged some of Ivy's former friends, carefully, anonymously, reminding them of the past. Subtle hints about her betrayals, the favors left unpaid. He watched as old alliances began to fray once more. The web of her past mistakes was unraveling, thread by thread. But Blake's plan was more than just tearing Ivy down. He wanted her to feel the isolation he had felt, the emptiness of being abandoned when it mattered most. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. The message was brief but loaded. "I heard Ivy's back. You should be careful." Blake's lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. The pieces were moving into place. The game had begun. He leaned back, feeling a rush of power. After years of being the one left behind, the one forgotten, Blake was finally taking control. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice, and Ivy wouldn't see it coming. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Blake's apartment, casting thin lines of light across the cluttered desk. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for a moment before typing the first message. It was a calculated step, the opening move in a game he'd been playing silently for years. Blake knew revenge wasn't about violence or outbursts. It was subtle, surgical. It was the quiet collapse of trust and reputation, a slow unraveling of everything Ivy had taken for granted. He wasn't just going to hurt her. He was going to dismantle the foundation she'd built her life on. He sent the first anonymous message to one of Ivy's oldest friends, someone she had betrayed badly. The message was simple but effective. "Remember when Ivy promised she'd be there and then disappeared? People deserve to know." Within hours, replies came flooding back, old wounds reopened. Blake read through the responses, feeling a bitter satisfaction as the cracks in Ivy's social circle started to show. But as the day went on, Blake's phone buzzed with a message from Ivy herself. "Blake, please. I know I screwed up before. I'm not the same person. Can we talk?" Blake stared at the screen, his heart pounding in an unexpected rhythm. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to let the silence speak louder than any conversation. But another part, buried deep beneath the layers of anger and betrayal, remembered the girl who once meant everything to him. He debated for what felt like hours, wrestling with a decision that wasn't just about Ivy, but about himself. Was he ready to face the past, to confront the pain head-on, or was it safer to keep the walls up, to let revenge be the final word? Finally, he typed back a simple reply. "Meet me at the old cafe. Noon." The hours leading to the meeting were a whirlwind of memories and doubts. Blake found himself revisiting moments he had tried to bury. The laughter, the trust, the gradual unraveling of it all. At noon, Blake sat across from Ivy, the air between them thick with unspoken words. She looked worn, her eyes reflecting a mixture of guilt and hope. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I was selfish. I thought I could handle everything on my own, but I was wrong." Blake's gaze hardened. "You left me when I needed you most. That's not easy to forgive." Their conversation was a fragile dance between truth and pain, the past bleeding into the present. But beneath it all, Blake knew this was just the beginning, not of reconciliation, but of a reckoning. As they parted ways, Blake felt a strange calm. The game had shifted. Revenge wasn't just about punishing Ivy, it was about reclaiming himself. And Blake was ready to win. The days following their tense meeting at the cafe were heavy with unspoken tension. Blake felt the weight of every glance, every whispered conversation he overheard when he passed through familiar streets. Ivy was no longer untouchable. She was fragile, a house built on shaky ground. Blake's mind worked relentlessly, mapping out the next steps. He wasn't impulsive. This was a carefully crafted chess game. Every move counted. He started reaching out to Ivy's professional contacts, subtly planting seeds of doubt. A late payment here, a missed deadline there. Small cracks, barely noticeable, but enough to ignite suspicion. At the same time, Blake noticed the toll it was taking on him. He caught himself replaying Ivy's apology, wondering if there was more behind her words. Regret, fear, or maybe even desperation. He hated that part of himself for feeling empathy. It was a vulnerability he wasn't ready to expose. Ivy's world began to unravel in quiet, painful ways. Former friends who had once welcomed her now turned their backs, skeptical and cold. The landlord who once overlooked her late rent started sending notices. At her job, whispers floated about her reliability, and Blake's subtle nudges kept those rumors alive. One evening, Blake sat alone in his apartment, the city's noise distant and muted. His phone buzzed. A message from Ivy. "Blake, can we talk? I don't know how much longer I can hold on." For a moment, Blake's resolve wavered. The lines between justice and cruelty blurred, but he reminded himself why he started this journey. The nights he spent alone, the times Ivy abandoned him. He typed back, firm but not unkind. "You made your choices, now face them." The game was far from over, but Blake felt the first flicker of satisfaction. The woman who once ignored his pain was now confronting her own. Yet, beneath the cold exterior, a storm brewed inside him. Revenge was sweet, but Blake knew it wasn't enough. There was something else he needed. Closure. And he was willing to go to any lengths to find it. The city had a way of swallowing secrets, of hiding pain beneath the constant hum of traffic and flickering neon lights. But Blake refused to let Ivy's secrets stay buried any longer. Every day, every calculated move was another thread unraveling the fragile tapestry of her life. His hands sometimes trembled, not from fear or hesitation, but from the sheer weight of what he was unleashing. This was no longer just about Ivy. It was about Blake reclaiming every ounce of dignity and power he'd lost. Ivy's descent was faster, steeper than Blake anticipated. The woman who once carried herself with unshakable confidence now shuffled through her days like a ghost. Calls went unanswered. Messages were ignored. She vanished into herself, a shell haunted by regret and fear. Blake watched from a distance, feeling a bitter cocktail of satisfaction and an emptiness he hadn't expected. One chilly autumn evening, Blake found himself standing outside Ivy's new apartment. The building was a far cry from the place she'd once called home. Small, cramped, and worn down by neglect. Faint light flickered behind drawn curtains. He hesitated, heart pounding not with anger, but a confusing ache he wasn't ready to name. Inside, Ivy sat curled into a threadbare armchair, clutching an old photo of them, smiling, young, and full of hope. Tears traced silent paths down her face. She was mourning more than just her shattered life. She was mourning the loss of the friend she had betrayed, the man she had left behind when he needed her most. Blake's phone buzzed, snapping him back to reality. A message from a mutual friend confirmed what he already feared. She was utterly alone. The final piece in Blake's plan had fallen into place. Ivy had nobody left to lean on. But the more Blake saw her unravel, the more the lines between justice and cruelty blurred. Was he becoming the monster he swore to avoid? Was this quiet revenge eating away at the man he once was? His mind wrestled with questions he couldn't silence. The memories of shared laughter, whispered secrets, and midnight promises clashed violently with the cold, calculated moves he was making now. Yet, beneath the confusion, one truth was clear. Blake was no longer the same man who had once begged for help. This was his reckoning, and it demanded a final, decisive strike. He reviewed his plan for the last time, expose Ivy's long-hidden mistakes to the very people she once fooled, rip away the last threads of her carefully maintained facade. Public, undeniable, no room for excuses. Blake took a deep breath, his resolve hardening like steel. He squared his shoulders, his eyes steeling with determination. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it head-on. The endgame was near. And Blake would not back down. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window as Blake sat alone in his apartment. the faint hum of traffic barely penetrating the thick silence that surrounded him. The rhythmic tapping of rain against the glass was the only companion to the storm raging inside his mind. Ivy's downfall had escalated quickly. The subtle cracks had turned into full-blown fractures, and the carefully constructed facade she'd worn for years was crumbling under the weight of exposure. It hadn't been easy. Every anonymous email sent, every whispered rumor seeded among Ivy's contacts was a calculated strike designed to dismantle her world piece by piece. Blake had watched from the shadows as doors closed on her, as friends turned cold, and as her professional reputation took hits that left her scrambling for footing. But even as Ivy's life spiraled, Blake's thoughts weren't just about victory anymore. They were tangled in doubt, in memories that refused to fade. Earlier that afternoon, Ivy's voice had come through his phone. A fragile, almost broken plea. "Blake, please, you don't have to do this. I'm not the same person I was back then. Give me a chance." For a moment, the years collapsed. The girl who had been his closest confidant, his partner in crime, the one who had shared secrets, whispered in the dark, spoke again. Blake's fingers tightened around the phone, the familiar ache of betrayal resurfacing with brutal clarity. "I'm not tearing your life apart, Ivy," Blake said, voice steady but cold. "You did this to yourself. I'm just showing everyone the truth." The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with regret, with the weight of all the things neither of them had said. But Blake knew this wasn't just about Ivy anymore. The past had tangled them together. But the future was still unwritten. As he hung up, his phone buzzed again. Another message from an unknown number. "You're getting too close. Be careful who you trust." Blake's jaw clenched. Someone else was watching. Someone who wanted Ivy's secrets buried deep and hidden forever. The stakes had risen. What had started as personal revenge was now a dangerous game with unknown players. His mind raced through possibilities. Who could it be? Someone Ivy had crossed? Or worse, someone from Blake's own past, pulling strings from the shadows? Despite the unease, a strange thrill surged through him. Blake wasn't just chasing revenge anymore. He was chasing the truth. The deeper Ivy's lies went, the more Blake realized how much more there was to uncover. There were whispers of debts far worse than money, of people who didn't just want to see Ivy fail. They wanted to destroy her. The rain outside intensified, matching the turmoil within. Blake rose, pacing the room as fragments of memories flashed. Laughter shared in sunlit parks, secrets spilled over cheap coffee, the raw pain of being left behind. But beneath the flood of emotions, Blake felt something new, an unyielding resolve. The man who had once been broken was now reshaping himself through the very fire of betrayal. He wasn't just seeking revenge. He was rewriting the story. Blake sat back down and opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The game was no longer just about Ivy. It was bigger, darker, more complex, and Blake was ready to face it head-on. Whatever came next, he promised himself, he wouldn't run. Because this time, Blake was playing for keeps. Blake sat in the half-dark of his apartment, the only illumination coming from the cold blue light of his laptop screen. His fingers paused over the keyboard, the tension coiling in his shoulders like a tightly wound spring. The anonymous messages had started as vague warnings, but now they carried a sinister weight. Threats disguised as cryptic notes that made the air around him feel heavier with every passing hour. He ran through the messages again, eyes scanning for anything missed. Numbers scrambled and masked, IP addresses bouncing through proxies like ghosts hiding from detection. Whoever was behind this wasn't just skilled, they were deliberate, patient, and terrifyingly close. This wasn't a random act of malice. This was personal. His thoughts drifted back to Ivy, her desperate plea still ringing in his ears. But now he wondered, was she a pawn in someone else's game? Or was she hiding a deeper truth, one that could unravel everything Blake thought he knew? The next morning, Blake awoke to the shrill buzz of his phone. A new message from an unknown number. Not everyone forgets the past. Some debts aren't just financial. A knot tightened in Blake's stomach. Later that day, a small package was slipped under his door. No return address, no explanation. Inside, a faded photograph lay carefully folded. It was a picture from years ago. Blake and Ivy caught in a moment of unguarded laughter on a bright afternoon, their faces young and full of promise. On the back of the photo, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Not everyone forgets." Blake's heart hammered in his chest. The message was clear. This wasn't just about Ivy's mistakes. Someone else was watching, someone who held grudges deeper and darker than Blake had imagined. He paced his apartment, mind racing through possibilities. Who could it be? Someone Ivy crossed long ago? Or someone from Blake's own past, lurking unseen until now? The boundaries between friend and enemy blurred with every thought, every shadow stretching longer in the corners of his vision. He recalled the quiet tensions in Ivy's voice during their last conversation, hints of fear, fragments of secrets she hadn't shared. Was she hiding more than Blake realized? Could she still be playing a dangerous game, and he was just another piece? Blake's phone buzzed again. A text this time. "Be careful who you trust. Not all ghosts are buried." The message chilled him to the bone. The past was no longer a distant memory. It was a living, breathing force threatening to consume them both. He looked out the window, city lights flickering like distant stars swallowed by the night. This was more than a game now. It was survival. Blake's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. He reached for his coat, determination burning bright in his eyes. The shadows in the dark were closing in, but Blake was ready to face them head-on. The night was thick with tension as Blake stepped into the dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a cold silence that pressed against his skin. He wasn't sure who he expected to find inside. Ivy, the mysterious puppet master behind the threats, or someone else entirely. But one thing was certain. This was the final act. Inside, the faint glow of a single hanging bulb illuminated a figure seated at a table. Ivy. Her face was pale, eyes wary but defiant. Behind her stood a shadowy man, his posture rigid, eyes sharp and calculating. Blake's gaze locked on Ivy first. "This ends tonight," he said, voice low but steady. Ivy's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think you know everything, Blake, but there are things you'll never understand." The man stepped forward, voice cold. "Blake, you've stirred up more than just old wounds. This city has its rules, and you broke them. Now, it's time to pay." For a moment, the room held its breath. Blake swallowed his fear, his anger, and focused on the truth. The truth he had chased for so long. The secrets Ivy tried to bury. The debts that weren't just about money. The people who pulled strings from the shadows. He looked Ivy in the eyes. "You could have been honest. We could have faced it together. But you chose the lies. I chose the truth." The man scoffed. But before he could react, a siren wailed in the distance. The sound of approaching police. Blake had called it in earlier. The final move in his plan. Justice wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure no one else got hurt. Ivy's face crumpled, the weight of years crashing down. The man's expression hardened, but there was no time left for threats. As the flashing lights grew louder, Blake stepped back, feeling a strange mix of relief and emptiness. This chapter was closing. But Blake knew his story wasn't over. Life had a way of throwing new battles in your path, new shadows to face. He walked into the night, the city breathing around him, and whispered to himself, "Another story, another fight. Until next time."